started, and so thank you for making it out this morning. And we are talking this morning about Isaiah. Of course, we've been going through Isaiah for the past few weeks, and we are going through Isaiah 28 through 35 this morning. And our title for this is God's Sovereign Word Spoken into the World, Awe. And we'll go into that, what that awe means in a moment. But two themes I'd like for you to keep your eyes open for in this passage are judgment and hope. We'll see judgment and hope just kind of rotating throughout this passage. All right, so the setting for this passage in Isaiah, these 8 chapters, is you have Assyria is coming. If you know the book of Isaiah, you know that in chapter 36 and 37, you have Sennacherib coming down to Jerusalem and almost wiping out Judah. And these chapters are setting the stage for that and also looking forward to the future. So we have a map on the handout. If you don't have a handout, does anyone not have a handout? All right. I'm thinking everyone has a handout. No one's raising their hand. All right. A lot of times when you have the prophets, you have these two different areas. You have the east and Egypt. Egypt's always there. But on the east, you have Assyria, you have Babylon, later you have Persia. And when someone from Assyria wanted to take out Egypt, or Babylon wanted to take out Egypt, they didn't go straight through the Arabian desert because it's really hard to move an army through the Arabian desert. So they would come along the top of that Crescent, often called the Fertile Crescent. So if you look on your map, you see an arrow kind of going down toward Syria, from Assyria down to Syria and Israel. That's the route they would take. And Egypt and Assyria, or Egypt and Babylon, would be the major powers. And Israel's in a really bad location because they're right between them. So anytime Assyria or Babylon wanted to come down and take out Egypt or wanted to attack the other major power, they're coming right through Israel. And so that's kind of what's going on right now. And that kind of also plays into the alliances and kind of the political thinking of the time. So that's the background. Chapter 28, we have, in this passage, 28 through 35, we have a series of 6 woes. And woe to so-and-so, woe to so-and-so. In the ESV, they translate that awe. So that word awe, that's woe. If you were used to an older translation, you might have seen woe. You might be a little more familiar with that. But we're talking about woes, and the first woe is in chapter 28 against Ephraim and Jerusalem. Now, Ephraim is a placeholder for the kingdom of Israel. It's the northern 10 tribes. When you have the divided kingdom, you have Judah and Benjamin in the south. After Solomon, you have the other 10 tribes in the north. Ephraim is the most prominent of those tribes. So a lot of times in the prophets, you'll see Ephraim, and Ephraim is essentially talking about the kingdom of Israel. So he starts off by saying the proud crown, 28:1, the proud crown of the drunkards of Ephraim, talking about how great they are. They think that they have this flower, this beauty, this head on the rich valley, but the flower is fading. Because Assyria in 722 comes in and takes out the northern kingdom. So the kingdom of capital city of Samaria, the 10 tribes, they're wiped out. They're sent to different areas of the world. And so this part at the beginning is talking about Ephraim. And so Ephraim is very proud. They are very proud in their things. And this is going to inform Jerusalem, which is in 14. But let's look at 1 through 13 real quick. And you see often that judgment is coming. And this idea of, verse 4. You have a fading flower of its glorious beauty is on the head of the rich valley, will be like a first ripe fig before the summer. What does that mean? It means it's really ripe. It's about to happen. It's really soon. And in that day, the Lord of hosts will be a crown of glory. And oftentimes when you see these passages and these woes, they're going to pronounce some judgment and then point to God as their ultimate hope. And a lot of times the reason why they're in this mess to begin with is because they're not looking to God as their ultimate hope. They're not looking to Him as their salvation. In verse 14, we have 8 chapters, so I'm moving a little bit fast. So verse 14, we have kind of the main audience. Therefore, hear the word of the Lord. After this object lesson of Ephraim, They were proud. They didn't look to God, and they are going to be judged because of it. In verse 14, you have Jerusalem's judgment. During this time, I mentioned that you have Assyria coming, and they had this power struggle. Judah is stuck with Assyria coming, really mean and cruel invaders. They would be the type of invaders in the ancient period. They would take out a city. They would take all the heads of the guys they took out, and they'd stack them outside the gates as intimidation, that sort of thing. And these are the guys who are coming after Jerusalem. And Judah is very scared. There's a few options they have. They can fight. Probably wouldn't work. They could make an alliance with someone else to try to fight. They could just surrender, and hopefully they will be nice to us. Or they can trust in God. And God wants them to come trust in him. They're choosing, let's make an alliance with Egypt. Because Egypt's the other superpower. They're down south. They'll help us. And God says to them multiple times throughout these passages, that was the wrong decision. You didn't trust in me. You trusted in these alliances for people who can't help you. And so in verse 15, because you have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol, the grave, we have made an agreement. When the overwhelming whip passes through us, it will not come to us, for we have made lies a refuge, and in falsehood we have taken shelter. Therefore, thus says the Lord, it goes on. Now, this is Isaiah's interpretation of what they're saying. They're saying, hey, we just made this great alliance with Egypt. We'll be able to stand against Assyria. Isaiah says, actually what you're saying is that you've made a covenant with death. You've made Sheol, you made an agreement with the grave. You're going to die because of this. And you have made lies your refuge. And what you should have done is go to God. In verse 16, that God says, I am the one who has laid a foundation in Zion, a stone, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone of a sure foundation. Whoever believes will not be in haste, will not be anxious, will not be really worked up about everything. And I will make justice the line and righteousness the plumb line, and hail will sweep away the refuge of lies. So because of this, God is saying that I have made a stone. We know that in the New Testament, that's referring to Christ. In this passage, what we're saying, what Isaiah is going with is that he is saying, let me get my right page here. All right. And in this passage, what he's saying is that he's talking about how God is going to make justice the line. He is actually going to give them what they deserve, which, as you know, that is not always a great thing. And what God is going to do is he is going to make it where, let's see here. He's going to make justice and righteousness the standard or the measure of what's going to happen. And all their lies are going to go away. All these lies that they've been trusting in, these covenant with death is going to go away. The agreement with the grave will not stand, so their alliance is not going to hold up. And when the scourge passes through, they'll be beaten down. And it will be sheer terror for them to understand the message. And in verse 21 is interesting because it talks about God will rise up as on Mount Perazim and in the valley of Gibeon. That's a reference to David fighting against the Philistines. In that passage, in 2 Samuel, God is fighting for Israel. And you may recall that this is the passage where David says, should I go up against the Philistines? And God says, yes. And this is how you're going to do it. Then a few verses later, should I go up against the Philistines? Yes. And do it this way this time. And in that passage, God is fighting for Israel against the Philistines. In this passage, God is saying, I'm going to fight against you. And just like the Philistines couldn't stand against Israel, the kingdom of Judah cannot stand against what's coming because God's fighting against them because of the judgment. Now that's very dark and dreary for the kingdom of Judah. But in verses 23 through 29, God gives this illustration of farming. And what does farming have to do with political conquest? Well, in verse 23, he talks about 24, he says, does he who plows for sowing plow continually? Does he who continually open and harrow his ground? So the idea is that this plowing is the farmer is rooting up, turning over, tearing up the ground. He's judging the ground in one sense. But just like the farmer is not going to plow his field only, he's not going to spend 9 months of the year plowing out his ground. He's going to stop at some point. And just like that, God's not going to give them complete destruction and total destruction. He's going to judge them. He's going to plow up the ground, but it's for better things to come later. And in verse 27 through 29, it talks about dill and cumin. And it's not only the right timing for the judgment, the right amount of time, but it's the right method. It's to get what they want. So it's not a complete destruction, but God is going to do it in the right way. Verse 29 kind of sums that up when he says, "This also comes from the Lord of hosts. He is wonderful in counsel and excellent in wisdom." So that's the first woe. Second woe, we have a woe against Jerusalem, chapter 29. In 29, we have two different woes. And the first one, you're like, how do you know that's about Jerusalem? That's about Ariel. Ariel's from The Little Mermaid. Ariel is actually a word that means either lion, or it could mean temple hearth, altar hearth. And in this passage, in verse 8, let me start off. Verse 1, Ariel, the city where David encamped. That's the city where David settled. All right, so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about this place called Ariel. Verse 8, jump down there. He's talking about all these people who are going to be fighting against it. In verse 8, the multitude of all the nations be that fight against Mount Zion. Mount Zion is another term for Jerusalem. So this whole passage in 1 through 14, when he's talking about Ariel, he's talking about Jerusalem. So this is a woe against Jerusalem. And verses 1 through 8, you have God is going to encamp around them, and they're going to be humbled. And you see this in chapter 30 next week. That you'll see about Sennacherib coming, and Sennacherib's the leader of Assyria, and Judah's brought low. Judah's humbled. But then in verse 5 through 8, you have this is all happening, but what God's going to do is that he's going to take these armies that are encamped around, and he's just going to move them away like the dust. They're just going to be blown away. And that's essentially what happens in 36 and 37, where Hezekiah prays to God, and God sends an angel, and the angel wipes out the Assyrian army. The Assyrian army leaves. They're like, we're not dealing with this. We've already lost too many troops to something we're not even sure what's going on. So you have 1 through 8. You have this bringing low. You have their salvation through 5 through 8. Verse 9 through 14, you have this spiritual blindness. And God, even through all this, you would think that the response would be thankfulness and turning to God. And this idea could be that they're thinking, boy, our Egyptian policy really worked. Because they're thinking, hey, everything worked out okay. But actually what we have in 9 through 14 is we have blindness. We have closed the eyes of their prophets, covered the eyes of the heads of their seers. In verse 11, the vision of all this has become to you like the words of a book that is sealed. When men give it to one who can read, saying, read this, he says, I can't, for it's sealed. And when they give the book to one who cannot read, saying, read this, he says, I cannot read. You have blindness, you have ignorance, and all of that is going on. That is part of this judgment that God is giving them because of their sin. So verses 13 and 14, we come to verse 13. We really have one of the hearts of why this is happening. And the Lord says, because this people draw near with their mouth and honor me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me, and their fear of me is a commandment taught by men. So they are saying all the right things, but their hearts are far from him. That's a common theme throughout the Old Testament with Israel. And again, it's a common theme with humans. Let's just face it. It's a common theme with humans, and Israel in this case they're saying things, they're trying to do things that fear of me. That could also be worship. So they're doing the worship because they're supposed to, not because they want to do it. And therefore, verse 14, therefore, behold, I will again do wonderful things with this people, with wonder upon wonder, and the wisdom of the wise men shall perish, and the discernment of the discerning men shall be hidden. All these things that they're putting their trust in, their wise, their worldly wisdom, the discernment, the intelligence that they're trying to put their faith in, that's all going to be going away because God's going to be doing something wonderful for them. Verse 15, we get to the third woe. And the third woe we have is verse 15 we have, or woe, you who hide deep from the Lord your counsel, whose deeds are in the dark, and who say, who sees us, who knows us? You turn things upside down. Shall the potter be regarded as the clay? The thing that made should say of its maker, he did not make me. Or the thing formed say of him who formed it, he has no understanding. I really like I'm going to read to you what the NIV says. I think, to me, it was a little bit clearer, at least. NIV, for those two verses, has, woe to those who go to great depths to hide their plans from the Lord, who do their work in darkness and think, who sees us? Who will know it? Verse 16, you turn things upside down, as if the potter were thought to be like the clay. Shall what is formed say to the one who formed it, you did not make me? Can the pot say to the potter, you know nothing? Essentially, there are three things they're doing. They're hiding their plans from God, they're doing their works in darkness, and they're thinking really ignorant thoughts, basically. Who will know us? Who will think? And Isaiah's response is, you don't understand how the world works. You've turned everything upside down because you have tried to put God under you, and God is actually over you. So you have this woe in verses 15 and 16. But then in 17 through the rest of the chapter, we pretty much have a lot of hope. Again, we have throughout these passages judgment and hope, judgment and hope. It just keeps on going back and forth. You never have really an extended period for, like in Isaiah, from this, at least in this section, you don't really have judgment, and no hope to kind of balance that out, to kind of give comfort. But in 17, we have, is it not a very little while until Lebanon, which shall be turned into a fruitful field, and the fruitful field shall be regarded as a forest? In that day the deaf shall hear the words of a book, and out of the gloom and darkness the eyes of the blind shall see. The meek shall obtain fresh joy in the Lord, and the poor among mankind shall exult in the Holy One of Israel. And so we have physical restoration. We have transformation of the physical. We have the individual health transformations through the deaf hearing, the blind seeing. We have spiritual restoration. The meek shall obtain fresh joy in God, and the poor shall exult in God. And then you have social transformation. With 20 through 21, you have the ruthless shall come to nothing, the scoffer will cease, and all who watch to do evil shall be cut off. Who by a word make a man out to be an offender, who lay a snare for him who proves in the gate, and with an empty plea turn aside who is in the right. One commentator, Motier, says, we meet and turn the false witness, the bent lawyer, and the corrupt judge in that verse 21. So people who are, the people who will be cut off are people who give false witness, those who are lawyers who turn aside and try to get that person who defends the helpless, those who reprove in the gate. That's that person who would advocate for others. This other person would try to lay a snare for them. And then at the end of verse 21, this judge who is corrupt. So those people are going to be cut off. And then in 22 through 24, we have Jacob. Jacob is viewed as being ashamed of Israel right now. Because of looking at what Israel is doing, his descendants, he is ashamed, and Jacob is no longer going to be ashamed. And when he sees his children, he will sanctify their name and so forth. So that's 15 through 24. As you can tell, we're moving quickly. The fourth woe in chapter 30, we have to get to 35. We'll make it. 35, we have fourth woe against an Egyptian alliance. Now we're really coming to some of the more practical applications to all the principles he's been talking about, how you need to trust in God. You need to put your faith in God and not trust in Egypt. And he was being very pointed at this point. 30 verse 1, all stubborn children declares the Lord, who carry out a plan but not mine, who make an alliance but not of my spirit, that they may add sin to sin, who set out to go down to Egypt without asking for my direction, to take refuge in the protection of Pharaoh and to seek shelter in the shadow of Egypt. And he goes on to say, what can Egypt do that I can't? And over and over again, he talks about how, verse 7, let's just sum it up in verse 7. Egypt's help is worthless and empty. Therefore I have called her Rahab, who sits still. NIV translates that as Rahab, do nothing, which I thought was an interesting way of phrasing that. But Egypt cannot help them. And they have put all their eggs in the Egypt basket. And it's going to come back and get them. So at this point, just to let you know a little bit of background for Egypt, Egypt is ruled by an Ethiopian dynasty, a dynasty that came out of Ethiopia. They rule quite a lot of territory from the top of Egypt down to Ethiopia area. Those two cities in verse 4, Zoan and Hanes, those are like the northern area of control and the southern area of control. So that's what's going on there. And then in verse 18 through 17, we've already seen this once already in this section, but Judah will not listen. So verse 9, they are a rebellious people, lying children. Children are willing to hear the instruction of the Lord, who say to their seers, do not see, and to their prophets, do not prophesy to us what is right. Speak to us smooth things, prophecy illusions. When I read this, I think of that passage in Timothy, where it talks about they want teachers, they have itching ears, and they just want teachers who will just kind of itch that ear for them. But even in this section, you have preachers, they don't want them not to preach. They say, go ahead and prophesy, go ahead and preach. Just don't tell us things that we're supposed to hear. Don't tell us the things that are right. Don't tell us the things that make our consciences tough. Speak to us smooth things. And let's see here. So in verse 15, going down, for thus says the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, in returning and rest you shall be saved, in quietness and trust you shall be your strength. But you were unwilling, and you said, no, we will flee upon horses. Therefore you shall flee away, and we will ride upon swift steeds. Therefore your pursuers shall be swift. 1,000 shall flee at the threat of one. At the threat of 5 you shall flee. 2 you are left, like a flagstaff on the top of a mountain, like a signal on a hill. This verse in 17, you have God saying, come to me, and they're saying, no, we're going to do our own way. And at the end of verse 17, you have that 1,000 shall flee at the threat of 1, threat of 5 you shall flee. This is a reversal of what you see in the Pentateuch. In Leviticus 27:8, it says, 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall chase 10,000, and your enemies shall fall before you by the sword. This is just a flip of that. The judgment is that instead of 5 of you chasing 1,000, 5 of them are going to chase all of you. And so you have judgment in many ways, just hearkening back to the Pentateuch. Verse 18. Again, we had judgment, now we're back to hope. With hope, we have, therefore the Lord waits to be gracious to you, and therefore he exalts himself to show mercy to you. For the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are all those who wait for him. And you have so many things in this passage of 18 through 26. So I'm going to, if you're right there, I'm going to read through a few of these things that you see in verses 19 through 26 especially. In verse 20, your teacher will not hide himself anymore. God's not going to hide himself. Verse 20, your eyes will see your teacher. Verse 21, they will know the right way. They'll hear a word behind them saying that this is the right way. Verse 22, their idols will be destroyed. Verses 23 through 25, you have the idea of the grain and the livestock is going to flourish. With an agricultural setting that they're in, this is big. Means that prosperity. This means no hunger, no famine. Verse 25, at the end of verse 25, you have the destruction of evil. You have the destruction of evil. Let's see here. In the day of great slaughter, when the towers fall, there will be. Compare this to, I'm going to move over to Isaiah 22. I forgot to write that one down. 2 verses 12 through 17. It talks about how, for the Lord of hosts has a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up, and it shall be brought low, against all the cedars of Lebanon, lofty and lifted up, and against all the oaks of Bashan, against all the lofty mountains, against all the uplifted hills, against every high tower, and against every fortified wall, against all the ships of Tarshish, and against all the beautiful craft, and the haughtiness of men shall be humbled, and the lofty pride of men shall be brought low, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. So it's kind of hard, that end of verse 25 is kind of pointing back to a passage like that, where it talks about how there's not going to be a need for all these defenses and things like that, because evil is going to be destroyed. And then in verse 26, we have you have the healing and comfort in that verse. Then in 27, we're back to judgment. Verse 27, we're back to judgment, and we're talking primarily about Assyria at this point. You can see that in verse 31. But look at the description of God that we have at the beginning of this. Behold, the name of the Lord comes from afar, burning with his anger, and in thick rising smoke. His lips are full of fury, and his tongue is like a devouring fire. His breath is like an overflowing stream that reaches up to the neck, to sift the nations with a sieve of destruction, and to place on the jaws of the peoples a bridle that leads astray. Throughout this, you have these images of God that are both loving and caring, and wanting to, verse 18, wanting to be gracious to you and so forth. But at the same time, God just as much is a force of destruction and wrath against his enemies, against those who are rebelling against him. So you have these two competing is the wrong word, complementary in a way that maybe we don't understand fully. You have these two aspects of God in these passages. So verse 33, we have, for a burning place has long been prepared. Indeed, for the king it is made ready. Its pyre made deep and wide with fire and wood in abundance. The breath of the Lord like a stream of sulfur kindles it. And burning place, that another word for that is topheth. You might have seen that in other passages. But the idea is, some people consider this could be a little bit of a description of hell in some ways, just because of the sulfur and things like that. But it's made for, this area is made for the king of Assyria. That's what it's there for. So this is the wrath of God coming down on Assyria in this passage. Chapter 31. So going on to the fifth woe. This is also about Egypt. But this one is about those who go down to Egypt. So again, trust in Egypt. Some of the same themes we see, this first 9 verses, we see that God is superior to Egypt. Verse 3, the Egyptians are man and not God, and their horses are flesh and not spirit. When the Lord stretches out his hand, the helper will stumble, and he who is helped will fall, and they will all perish together. So we have in here this idea of perishing. We have this idea of God is greater, but also just some of the language that we have. In verse 4, we have a lion, where a young lion growls over his prey. We also have in verse 9, at the end of verse 9, declares the Lord, whose fire is in Zion and whose furnace is in Jerusalem. Chapter 29, we had that word Ariel. The Ariel, two meanings of that word could be altar hearth. So you have this idea of this fire. You also have the other meaning is lions, Lion of Judah, that sort of idea. So it could be a connection there. It could be. I'm not going to say that it absolutely is, but there could be some connection there about what's going on there. So those who go down to Egypt. 31 and 32 should be viewed as kind of a package. A lot of times, as you may have already picked up in these woes, we've been moving fast, but there's judgment, there's hope together. And 31 and 32 are kind of viewed as a unit by a lot of commentators, because that 31 has the judgment, and 32 has the hope, basically. So it's kind of packaged together. Same idea with the sixth woe, 33 through 35, having judgment and hope together. But in 32, we move to the king, the righteous king. So we have the righteous king in the first 8 verses. And this is ultimately fulfilled in Christ. We have a king reigning in righteousness. And all of these things that are going on is this ideal version of what should be happening with kings. This is what kings should be doing. And we know that kings in this world will meet that to some extent, but they're also going to fall short. The one who meets all this and is able to showcase this and be an exemplar is Christ. So I'm going to kind of go through a list here, some things that we see in this passage. We see in verse 1 that the king reigns in righteousness. The princes rule in justice. Not only the king reigns in righteousness, but his subordinates, his princes, rule in justice as well. So it's not just one guy at the top who's doing really well, but all his underlings are corrupt. All those people are ruling in justice. And those people are shelters. Those good rulers are like shelters against the storms, against the hardness of life. And in verse 3, the eyes of those who see will not be closed. The ears of those who hear will give attention. The heart of the hasty will understand and know, and the tongues of stammerers will hasten to speak distinctly. So you have people paying attention, people understanding. Right now, what's going on in Judah? All these people are hearing. They're wanting to hear what they only want to. They only want to hear what they want to hear. They only want to see what they want to see. But in this future time, when the righteous king reigns, we're not going to have that problem where people aren't going to ignore what God is saying. These people are going to understand. They're going to see. In verse 5 through 8, the fool will no longer be called noble, nor the scoundrel said to be honorable. And then it kind of has this poem describing what's a fool, what's a scoundrel. Verse 6, for the fool, he speaks folly, his heart is busy with iniquity, practice ungodliness, utter error concerning the Lord, leaves the hungry unsatisfied, deprives the thirsty of drink. So that's the fool. He's not going to be called noble anymore. The scoundrel's devices are evil, planning wicked schemes, ruining the poor with lying words, even when the plea of the needy is right. So those type of people, they're not going to be called noble anymore. They're not going to be called honorable. In this world, we see it throughout history that sometimes the most powerful people are the most corrupt. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. We've heard that phrase. In this future kingdom with Christ, that's not going to happen. Those who are fools, those who are evil are not going to be called noble. They're not going to be called honorable. In verse 8, instead, he who is noble plans noble things, and on noble things he stands. Those are the people who are going to be exalted. Those are the people who are going to be viewed as noble. So, hope in verse 32. But we're back to judgment in verse 9. Verse 9 we have, rise up, you women who are at ease. Hear my voice, you complacent daughters. Give ear to my speech. In little more than a year you will shudder. So this is about a year away from Sennacherib coming, probably. This is probably what this is referring to. And remember, Samaria was taken out by Assyria in 722. Sennacherib is coming about 703, 702, so BC, so we move down in years as we go. So this is about 18 years later, 18, 19 years later. So we're right on the cusp of that. And so it's coming very soon, this judgment. And in verse, it says 9 through 14, but in 15 through 20, the rest of that chapter, we again come to renewal. And we have, until the Spirit of the Lord is poured upon us from on high, and the wilderness becomes a fruitful field, and the fruitful field is deemed a forest, then justice will dwell in the wilderness, and righteousness abide in the fruitful field. And the effect of the righteousness will be peace, and the result of the righteousness, quietness and trust forever. My people will abide in a peaceful habitation, in secure dwellings, and in quiet resting places. And it will hail when the forest falls down, and the city will be utterly laid low. And happy are you who sow beside all waters, who let the feet of the ox and the donkey rage free. And now we are at the last section of 33 through 35. And this is our sixth woe. So we've had woes against Ephraim, against Jerusalem, against those who have been trusting in Egypt. But now in verse 33, verse 1 of 33, we're getting to Assyria. So this woe is against Assyria. How do I know that? So look at this. It says in verse 1, all you destroyer. Now, it's very easy for us to view destroyer. We got Assyria. That we can see how they're a destroyer. then it says, you traitor, you destroyer who yourself has not been destroyed, you traitor whom none has betrayed. All right, this is probably referring to a passage in 2 Kings. 2 Kings 18, 13 through 18, we have Sennacherib coming, and he's coming against the fortified cities of Judah. And Hezekiah, the king of Judah at the time, he gets scared, obviously, because this is a massive army who's coming to take out his kingdom. And so I'm going to read to you that passage from 2 Kings. And it says, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. And Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, I have done wrong. Withdraw from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will bear. And the king of Assyria required of Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. And Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord, in the temple, and in the treasuries of the king's house. At that time, Hezekiah stripped the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord, and from the doorposts that Hezekiah, king of Judah, had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria. And the king of Assyria sent... All right, so let me pause there. So Sennacherib's invading. Hezekiah reaches out to him and says, just withdraw. I'll pay you anything you want. Just please leave. And Sennacherib says, give me 300 talents of silver, 30 talents of gold. Hezekiah does that. Sennacherib's response is, and the king of Assyria sent the Tartan, the Rabsaris, and the Rabshakeh with a great army from Lachish to the king Hezekiah in Jerusalem. So Sennacherib takes his money and sends the army anyway. So it makes it a little easier to spoil the city, I guess in his mind. But in this sense, he's a traitor in the sense that there was an agreement reached between Hezekiah and Sennacherib. I'm going to give you this money and you're going to leave. Sennacherib says, thank you for the money. We're going to go ahead and invade anyway. So that's where it's talking about with this traitor. So 33 is talking about Assyria. But interesting for this woe is that right at the beginning, we have this woe in the first verse, and then afterwards, you have 2 through 8, we have this response to God, this prayer to God, O Lord, be gracious to us, we wait for you, be our arm every morning, our salvation in the time of trouble. And it goes on. At this point, Judah has realized, we are in trouble. We need to reach out to God. What they should have done at the beginning, they're now doing. They're reaching out to God, and so they proclaim their faith in God, that God is able to save us. Verses 7, their heroes cry in the streets, the envoys of peace weep bitterly, the highways lie waste, the travelers cease, covenants are broken, cities are despised, there is no regard for man. So this is what's going on. This is kind of their reality right now. The heroes, the people they have put trust in, like Hezekiah, they're crying in the streets. Everything they could try to do has failed. They've tried to bribe them to leave. They haven't left. And they're still coming. The covenants, the agreements that they made are broken. The cities are despised. They're just taking out the cities. So now I will arise. In verse 10, we have God saying, now I will arise, says the Lord. Now I will lift myself up. Now I will be exalted. And it goes through and talks about how when God acts, things happen. In verse 11, it's talking about God is talking to the people who are against him. You're conceiving chaff, you give birth to stubble. So these things that they're coming up with, these ideas, are not going to work out. Your breath is a fire that will consume you, and the people will be burned to lime, like thorns cut down that are burned in the fire. So throughout this, you have God saying, you cannot save yourselves, I'm going to save you. And then talks about, I did want to mention this. In verse 13, you see, hear you who are far off what I have done. You who are near, acknowledge my might. Everyone is going to see what God's going to do here, and they're going to talk about it, and they are going to proclaim God's glory in the sense of, look at what God did for Judah. And at the end of verse 14, you have these questions. Who among us can dwell with the consuming fire? Who among us can dwell with everlasting burnings? That reminds me a lot of, then verse 15. He who walks righteously and speaks uprightly, who despises the gain of oppressions, who shakes his hand lest they hold a bribe, who stops his ear from hearing of bloodshed. That reminds me a lot of Psalm 15, like who can ascend to the hill of the Lord? Who can dwell in his holy place? Who has clean hands and a pure heart? That passage, this kind of reminds, when I read that, I was like, boy, that sounds really similar to Psalm 15. Verse 17, we have the beautiful king. And this could be a whole section by itself. We had the righteous king, a description of Christ before. Now we have another description of Christ with the, behold, your eyes will behold the king in his beauty. So there are a number of things we see about the king in this passage. We see in verse 17 his beauty, his territory, land that stretches afar. Verse 18, no more tribute being given or defenses being analyzed. The idea, where's the person who counts the tribute for the Assyrians? Count the towers for defense. No more foreign invaders in verse 19. Jerusalem is at peace, full of feasts in verse 20. God will be in Jerusalem in 21. Rivers will be in the city. So Jerusalem is not known for having a lot of rivers around there, but in this passage it will. In this future it will. There won't be a lot of, verse 21, 23 kind of indicate there's not a lot of shipping, but at the same time in verse 23 there's a lot of spoil to pass out. Verse 22, God is the law judge and the lawgiver. Verse 24, there's no inhabitant will say, I am sick, and the people who dwell there will be forgiven their iniquity. So we're looking at this future time where there's no sickness in this land. So 34, back to 34, I'm running out of time, so bear with me. Chapter 34, we're back to judgment. So we had hope, we're back to judgment. And in judgment, in this case, it's on the nations in general. Verse 2, the Lord is enraged against all the nations and furious against all their hosts. He has devoted them to destruction, has given them over for slaughter. And he used Edom in verse 5 as an example of this, kind of what he's going to do to Edom. And Edom is, in verse 6, just to let you know, Basra, for the Lord has a sacrifice in Basra. That's the capital of Edom. So I did look it up, and it's actually not related to any of the other Basras we hear in the news all the time. It's a different city altogether. That was a surprise to me. I thought it was the same city. But so Basra in Edom is going to be judged. And in moving over to chapter 35, we have a return to Zion. And in this return to Zion, you have verse 10. Look at verse 10. This is where I get that name. Ransom of the Lord shall return and come to Zion, to Jerusalem with singing. And all of these things in here, verse 2, the glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon, those are mountains. They shall see the glory of the Lord and the majesty of our God. Strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. So all of these things are going to be the land's being renewed. The people are being encouraged in verses 3 and 4. And you see them being healed in 5 and 6. The eyes of the blind are opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy. And I'd like to close with looking at verses 8 through 10. And a highway shall be there, and it shall be called the way of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it. It shall belong to those who walk on the way. Even if they are fools, they shall not go astray. No lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast come upon it. For they shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be on their heads. They shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. And when I was reading this and closing it off in my study, I was thinking that, that way of holiness is not there yet, but it will be one day. And we, ransomed people of God, are going to be able to walk that path. We're going to be able to walk that path, and we'll be able to come to Jerusalem with singing. We'll be able to we'll have gladness and joy, and we won't have sorrow and sighing. And that's a great place to end this section of judgment and hope, but it ends on this really strong hope note. So that's Isaiah 28 through 35, really quick, very speeding along the way. If you have any questions, I'll be up front, or you can catch me between services. So thank you very much.